Hello and welcome. My name is Spencer Benson and I'm the chair of the ASM International Education Committee. I'm also the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning Enhancement at the University of Macau in Macau, China. This is a new position for me, and for many years I was at the University of Maryland as a faculty member in cell biology and molecular genetics and the director of the Center for Teaching Excellence at the University of Maryland. This slide is a signature slide for me, and it describes my goal in teaching in today's world. In today's world, content is available to students very readily by a click of a button, by a smartphone, anytime, anywhere. But what students really need is practice and opportunities to begin to think critically, be able to define problems. Using understanding by design can help in getting us to the point where students spend more time thinking and less time just collecting information. This workshop will have a number of parts. We'll start by some introductions, talk a little bit about what is understanding by design, spend time looking at what are learning outcomes, talk about assessments and alignments of learning outcomes, and then we'll talk about what learning activities are and how all of this fits together under the process of understanding by design. Let's start by a small exercise. What I want you to do is look at these 5 choices, think about your course, and then think about what is the primary goal in your course. Now, I want you to pause the video, turn to the people side of you, introduce yourself, and tell them which of the above is the primary goal in your teaching. In a few minutes or so, we'll come back to the video and restart it. So what is understanding by design? Understanding by design is a process that can be used to design a whole course, a module within a course, or even just a class. But it's a way of thinking about how to design a course and how to make teaching and learning more efficient. Understanding by design focuses on 3 related questions. The first question is, what do I want my students to learn, to know? The second question is, how will I determine or know if they learned it or know what they claim to know? And then the third part, what are the learning activities? What are the pedagogies that I and the class will use to facilitate their learning? So, what do I want my students to learn? How will I know if they learned it? And how will I help them learn these materials and concepts? As I said, understanding by design is a process. In fact, it's a reiterative process. And what it means is, like when we do research or science, we don't always get everything right the first time, and we will need to revisit and adjust each of the 3 components. Understanding by design starts by determining and identifying the desired results from the learning. What's the desired result for your class? Once we've determined the learning outcomes or the desired results, what type of evidence do we expect to acquire to show whether or not the outcomes have been obtained? These will generally be assessments that we do within the class, both formative and summative assessments. And then the third component is to develop the activities of the learning experiences the pedagogies that will facilitate students being able to accomplish the learning outcomes, to be successful in the assessments, and to arrive at a level of learning and understanding by doing the activities that will occur throughout the course of the semester. I want to start by asking you to think about establish some priorities. Not everything is of equal priority within a course or a class. Some things are worth being familiar with. Other things are important to know or be able to do. And most importantly, one of the outcomes, or what we hope, is that students will walk away with an enduring understanding that will retain with them, pass the test, into the next course, and beyond their graduation. So enduring understandings are things that students will know and take with them long after the class ends. Things that are important to know and do are skills that they need to know, or things they need to be able to do, such as effective writing and oral communications, or a procedure in a laboratory, or how to find something. Knowledge that is worth being familiar with is how they can find and retrieve information in today's information-rich world. Other things would be familiar, they need to be familiar with. Certain types of procedures in a lab, what is used for which procedure. Since this is a workshop and not a talking head video presentations, let's begin by doing some work. Think about one of your courses and what I want you to do for each of the circles. Things worth being familiar with, things that are important to know and do, and enduring understandings. Write 1 or 2 items for each of the levels. You should all have a worksheet to be able to work on from this. We're going to pause the video here and let you work for a few minutes working on each of these 3 items. Feel free to work in groups or alone. That is really up to you. Once there's been sufficient work time, what I'd like you to do is share your examples with the people beside you. And what I want you to do is you share in a think, pair, share type mode, share those, and then the facilitators that are on site will ask you to share to the whole group. And so there will be a sharing across the whole group, and once that is completed, pause the video to do that, and then restart the video. I want to focus now on learning outcomes. Learning outcomes answer the following guiding questions. What will my students know? What will my students be able to do? What will my students be able to appreciate having been through this learning activity, this class, or this course? These are things that they will have gained in the course of the semester, or the term, or the module. The learning outcomes are determined by you, the instructor. And most importantly, they need to be something that you can measure. So they're measurable objectives or outcomes. And traditionally, they start with the following phrase. Students will be able to. When people first start working with learning outcomes, there's sometimes a confusion between course goals and learning outcomes, and sometimes the terms are used interchangeably. People will talk about learning goals versus learning outcomes, or course outcomes versus learning goals. But goals and outcomes are not the same thing. For our working definition, goals are the overarching guide and envisioned endpoints, and often they're not readily measurable. A goal for many courses and many classes, and certainly a goal for a university education, that students will become lifelong learners. It's not very clear how we would accurately measure lifelong learning in our students. It would be a very long-term project. In contrast, learning outcomes are things one can readily and directly measurable. Students will be able to do X, and they're measured by looking at the products that the students produce. These products could be papers, performances on tests, surveys. They are artifacts that are the product that students produce during the course of the semester for your course. Now, to be fair, often goals and outcomes overlap, and they are always connected. So let's see if we can clarify by writing some clear learning outcomes. Often learning outcomes, when we first start writing them, are unclear or represent elements of a curriculum rather than some action or product that the student will demonstrate. For example, I've seen learning outcomes state, we will cover 5 chapters of the text. That's a goal, but not a learning outcome. It doesn't say what it means to cover and what will be the result of covering this. Let's look at 2 learning outcomes and then look at how we might refine those. The first one, students will understand the 5 reasons for conducting an environmental assessment. It looks like a good learning outcome. The problem is, or the challenge is, how do we measure understanding? It's difficult to measure understanding in a direct fashion. The second learning outcome, students will develop an appreciation of cultural diversity in the workplace, also appears to be a good and appropriate learning outcome. However, it's unclear what we mean by develop an appreciation. Does this mean just increase in appreciation? Does it mean a type of appreciation? And how would we measure that they developed it? We'd have to look at least 2 points. Let's see if we can refine these and make them more easily measurable. The first one, students will understand the 5 reasons for conducting an environmental assessment. We could refine and state, students will describe 5 reasons for conducting an environmental assessment. This is the type of assessment and the type of test or quiz that we could easily grade, score, and depending on the product from individual students and the products from the class, we could get a pretty good idea of their level of understanding. By having students describe 5 reasons, we can measure or infer a level of understanding. The original one, students will develop an appreciation of cultural diversity in the workplace, we can refine to say students will summarize in writing their feelings about cultural diversity in the workplace. By looking at the student products, we should be able to get a good assessment of students' appreciation of cultural diversity. And if we do this at 2 different points in the class, we could actually get an indication of how much their appreciation developed or changed. Let's go back to our worksheet activities. What I want you to do is to think about one of your classes and then write several learning outcomes for it. Start it with students will be able to. or students will. What we're going to do here, as we did before, is pause the video, give you some work time, and then the facilitators in the workshop will ask you to share your example with the people beside you, discuss it, learn from them, and then they'll ask you, each of the groups, to report out to the larger community. Once the reporting out is done, please restart the video. So, the summary and take-home regarding learning outcomes are that they're measurable changes in student knowledge, skills, attitude, or appreciation as a result of a course of study, i.e. learning, and they're determined by you, the faculty. Let's come to the second part of understanding by design, and that is, once we have the learning outcomes, how will we know whether students have achieved them and whether our class has been successful? So what would determine acceptable evidence? So the characteristics of good evidence might include the following. Good evidence is course and discipline dependent. For example, the evidence about being able to effectively communicate orally in a speech course requires that the evidence of students presenting speeches. Good evidence align with the learning outcomes. The learning outcome is that students will be able to write a lab report requires that they write and turn in lab reports, and that the activities within the class should provide opportunities for them to practice and learn how to write a good lab report or a project report of that sort. So they need to align with the learning outcomes. Critical thinking is often one of the goals of an education, but it's also one of the outcomes for many courses. Students will be able to think critically about X, microbiology, pathogenics, immunology. And this requires appropriate class activities, but equally it requires the appropriate types of assessments so that we can measure critical thinking. Critical thinking can be measured by many different types of assessments, but simply didactic regurgitation or memorization of content does not necessarily imply critical thinking. So multiple choice test questions to assess critical thinking are often difficult to write. Written prompts and short answers are a little easier to construct. So the evidence could be in a variety of forms, but it must align. But most importantly, the evidence must be meaningful to the students and peers. It must, and it needs to be embedded in the course activities. It's too much work and does not make sense to have the measurement of the learning outcomes be an add-on to the course. They need to be embedded in the course and embedded in the assessments that are part of the course. So good evidence are meaningful assessments that are embedded in the course, and they could either be formative assessments that provide feedback, or they could be summative assessments that are used for assigning grades. Let's come back to our three circles. So the question is, what types of assessments would we use for each of the three components? As we can see here, for things that are worth being familiar with or important to know and do, often traditional quizzes and tests are sufficient, and they can allow us to align the assessment with the outcome to each of these three levels of priority. Often they can be pencil and paper, selective responses, and such. Enduring understandings are perhaps more important, but also more difficult to assess, and often these required performance tasks and projects. They require students to do authentic work within the discipline, and often the work is complex. They're more difficult often to grade, but they are the types of assessments that give us confidence that students have a true and enduring understanding. Let's start with an example, or let me give you an example from my own class of how we connect learning outcomes and assessments. The alignment question. How do you align the assessments to the learning outcomes? How do we know, or what would be the evidence that students have obtained the learning outcomes? These are from a course called Microbes in Society I've taught for many years. It is a non-majors course that satisfies a general education component, and it's directed at students who are not scientists. Specifically, this course has been aligned with the needs of pre-service teachers who will teach in grades 1 through 6. You'll notice for the course, I have 5 learning outcomes. Please notice the verbs. Students will be able to describe. Students will be able to demonstrate. Students will be able to critically read. Students will be able to describe how science is part of everyday life. And students will be able to identify and appreciate the cultural and social dimensions of science. So 5 goals and a series of types of assessments I use in the course. So I use a variety of different assessments from multiple choice quizzes that are online and auto-graded to traditional exams to group projects. You will notice that for some of the assessments, they are really directed at a single learning outcome, but other assessments cover many learning outcomes. For example, the writing pieces, one of which is writing about a museum visit, can be used to assess 4 different learning outcomes. Likewise, the rather significant group project, which is worth about 25% of the course grades, again, the products in that group project can be used to look at and assess 4 different learning outcomes. In the traditional short exams, you'll notice that short answer and essay questions can be used to assess learning outcomes 1, 2, and 4. And learning outcome 3, which is the ability to critically read biological and microbiology information from popular press, journals, and other sources, is gotten at by having within the tests a news article that they have to read and analyze. You should also note that each of the learning outcomes is assessed by more than one type of assessment. So each learning outcome, there are more than data points from different types of student products to tell me how well the student is doing in terms of obtaining the learning outcome. But equally important, how well I'm doing in teaching this course and getting the students in the course as a whole to achieve the learning outcomes, which are the goals for this course. The goal of the course is for students to be able to do all 5 of these. The learning outcome is measured at each one, and it's connected to a variety of assessment activities. Let's come back to our diagram. We've looked at the desired outcome, the learning outcomes. We've talked a bit about acceptable evidence. Now let's think about and talk about what will the learning activities or the pedagogies for the class be. Note that we are in the final phase or piece of designing this course, but we've not yet talked about content. Content is important, and content will be instrumental and embedded in the learning outcomes, in the assessments, and certainly in the learning experiences. So, what are the characteristics of the learning activities? Well, they need to align with the course goals. The learning activities are the types of things that support the course goals. So if one of the course goals is that students will be familiar with or be able to describe certain content pieces, then the appropriate activity and an effective activity may be lecture. The learning activities need to engage the students in active learning. This is particularly true for the enduring understanding components or priority. Enduring understanding requires active and multiple engagements in order for students to develop a deep and enduring understanding of a concept or a fact or a relationship. The learning activities need to align with the measures and assessment. The activity should help the student perform better on the tests, the quizzes, the measures, and these assessments. So one important question as we design an activity is to ask, how does this activity increase performance of students on the assessments? And lastly, the learning activities need to be transparent. By this we mean the students need to know what is expected of them, when it is expected, but equally important, although not on the slide, they need to understand why certain activities are being done, why we are using group work, because group work helps them to be active and engaged. So be transparent, explain to your students what is expected of them, when it is expected of them, but equally important, why the varying learning activities are used and embedded within the course. Let's do a little bit more work. Return to the worksheet and let's do activity 3. For each of the circles and each of the priorities, worth being familiar with, important to know and do, and enduring understanding, I want you to think about and write down a learning activity or pedagogy that you would use to facilitate that level. Again, we'll pause the video, give you time to work. Again, you're free to work individually or in groups. And once we've had you work for a few minutes and the facilitators in the room will know when that is, what we want you to do is share your examples and your output with the student, with the individuals around you. Again, the facilitators in the room will facilitate it reporting out so that the information generated individually and in groups is shared by everyone in the workshop. When the sharing is done, please restart the video. This is my interpretation or an approach to the types of activities that might be used for each of the circles. For things that are worth being familiar with and important to know and do, one might use both lectures and assigned readings or discussions, projects, and papers or portfolios. Many different pedagogies can be used to address these two levels. The more challenging one is what are the pedagogies that will lead students to enduring understandings. These often involve more active, hands-on activities, often involve projects or papers. They could involve thesis, discussion, exam questions that have discussion parts. So this really requires much more active engagement on the part of the student and also on the part of the teacher, because these activities may require more time and certainly more grading time. You'll note the light purple box at the bottom, and that is to remind you that the ASM Microbe Library resources are a good source for you to go and find learning activities and information that will facilitate and help you use an understanding by design approach for your class. Let's recap. Understanding by design is a reiterative process or way of thinking about course design. It starts with identifying specific learning outcomes, those things that students will know or be able to do. What do we want students to learn as a result of being in our course? We then ask the question, what is the evidence that they actually learned what we claim or what they claim they learned? And then we develop learning experiences or pedagogies that facilitate students meeting the learning outcomes and being successful on the assessments. Again, it's a reiterative process because often we will need to tweak or change a learning outcome, our assessment piece, or our pedagogies. And so these evolve to make sure there is better alignment, and as one changes, the others may very well need to change. So understanding by design focuses on three questions. What do I want my students to learn and or be able to do as a result of being in my class? How will I know if they can? How will I know if they learn this material? And then what learning activities or pedagogies will I use with the students, or will the students use with their peers to facilitate their learning so that they obtain the learning outcomes and do well on the assessments? Three questions. By now we're probably out of time, and so the fourth worksheet activity is a take-home lesson, take-home exercise. I want you to start by thinking about your greatest teaching challenge and then how you might use understanding by design to approach it. Also, I want you to think about what microbe library resources might you use to address it. The URL for the microbial library is at the bottom. It's www.microbelibrary.org, and it is available through the web. Thank you. The facilitators for the workshop will certainly be able to facilitate questions and comments and answers, and you should use this time now to share among yourselves both questions and comments. I wish I was there to participate. Maybe at a future time this will be possible. Again, thank you. Here are the references that I've used. They're on the web. There is a lot of information about understanding by design. It's also referred to as backwards design. It was developed by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTeague. And if you click on this link, it will take you there. We will hopefully provide you with a copy of these PowerPoints, but you can simply find it by your favorite search engine. Also, there is a good PowerPoint presentation from Michigan State on understanding by design. And lastly, this PowerPoint presentation is available as a PDF at the following URL. So thank you. Thank you for allowing me to work with you on this. This is my contact information. Please feel free to email me. Remember that teaching is leading students into a situation where they can only escape by thinking. The final piece I wanted to tell you about is at the University of Maryland Center for Teaching Excellence. Each year we produce a teaching resource guide, and this teaching resource guide is free and downloadable. Simply go to www.cte.umd.edu and you can download the most current version of it. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your workshop and conference. I look forward to meeting you in person at some point in the future.